You've entered Void of Rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 4,000 corrupted souls, but the Void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the Void? Now let's jump into today's story. The first drops of rain struck the windshield of Adrian Hallow's rusted sedan as he pulled off the mountain road. Through the twisted branches of ancient oaks, the skeletal remains of St. Luthar's abbey rose against the storm clouds like broken teeth. Lightning illuminated the ruins in stark relief, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Adrian killed the engine and sat in the growing darkness, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. 15 years. 15 years since he'd last set foot in a church. Since Father Morrison had looked him in the eye at Emma's funeral and spoken those damning words with such casual certainty. God's will, the old priest had said, his breath reeking of communion wine. Your sister burns in purgatory now, cleansing her soul of earthly sin. We must accept his divine plan. Emma had been 7 years old. She'd died screaming in the house fire while Adrian was at evening mass, serving as an altar boy, believing he was doing something holy. The irony had eaten at him like acid for years, transforming grief into something darker, hungrier. Adrian stepped out into the rain, pulling his coat tight against the wind. The abbey had been abandoned for over a century. Its congregation scattered when the roof collapsed during a Christmas service in 1923. Local legends claimed the building was cursed, that the priests who had served there had practiced rituals that went beyond the bounds of Christian doctrine. Adrian had spent months researching the place, following paper trails through dusty archives and interviewing elderly locals who crossed themselves when they spoke of St. Luthar's. The main entrance was blocked by fallen stones, but Adrian had come prepared. He made his way around the perimeter until he found a gap in the wall, where looters had broken through decades earlier. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating broken pews and shattered stained glass that crunched beneath his boots. The nave was a cathedral of decay. Ivy had grown through cracks in the walls, creating a canopy of shadows overhead. Rain dripped through holes in what remained of the roof, forming pools that reflected Adrian's light like dead eyes. But it was the altar that drew his attention, or rather, what lay beneath it. The floor stones were different here, newer than the rest despite their age. They formed a rectangular outline that shouldn't exist, a sealed space hidden beneath generations of worship. Adrian knelt and ran his fingers along the edges, feeling the subtle depressions where iron bands had been set into the stone itself. It took him 2 hours to pry up the stones with a crowbar he'd brought, his hands bleeding from the rough work. Beneath lay a coffin, unlike any he'd ever seen, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift in the flickering light. The metal was black as midnight, untouched by rust despite the centuries, and when Adrian touched it, the surface was warm. The locks were intricate, crafted by someone with both skill and twisted imagination. They depicted scenes of suffering in miniature, humans bent in impossible positions, their faces contorted in silent screams, yet they opened at his touch as if recognizing him, falling away with soft clicks that echoed in the ruined nave. Inside the coffin, wrapped in silk that crumbled at his touch, lay the Black Bible. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. The book was unlike anything in his years of theological research. Its cover was deep brown leather, but not cowhide or goatskin. This was something else, something that had once been alive in ways he didn't want to contemplate. Wire had been used to stitch the binding together, not thread, and the metal glowed faintly in the darkness, as if heated from within. When he lifted the book, pain shot through his hands like electrical current. The leather was warm and slightly damp, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He opened it carefully, afraid the ancient pages might crumble, but they were perfectly preserved. The first page contained a single line of text in elegant script that seemed to move as he watched. For each shepherd silenced, the word awakens. Adrian tried to turn to the next page, but it wouldn't budge. He applied more pressure, then used both hands, but the remaining pages were fused together as if they had been welded shut. Yet, even as he struggled with it, he began to hear something that made his blood run cold. Whispers, dozens of voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, all saying the same thing over and over. Adrian, Adrian, Adrian. He slammed the book shut and stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The whispers continued, muffled now but still audible, calling his name with increasing urgency. Rain poured through the broken roof, but the drops seemed to avoid the coffin entirely, leaving the space around it mysteriously dry. Adrian wrapped the book in his jacket and ran. That night, in his apartment 3 states away, the Black Bible sat on his kitchen table like a malignant tumor. Adrian had tried to put it in a closet, then a drawer, then the garage. But no matter where he placed it, he could feel its presence burning through walls and distance. The whispers had followed him home, growing stronger with each passing hour. His apartment was a testament to his obsession with the church's dark history. Every wall was covered with maps marking the locations of priests, newspaper clippings detailing scandals and cover-ups, photographs of abandoned religious sites. Red pins marked active parishes across the country, each one meticulously researched. He knew their schedules, their weaknesses, their secrets. But now, staring at the Black Bible, Adrian understood that his research had been guided by something beyond his own curiosity. Every article he'd found, every lead he'd followed, every priest whose routine he'd memorized, it had all led him to this moment. He opened the book again, and this time the whispers resolved into words he could understand. The shepherds must fall before the flock can be freed. You are the instrument, Adrian Hallow. You are the key that opens the way. The second page remained sealed, but Adrian could feel knowledge bleeding into his mind like ink into water. He saw images that weren't quite memories. A village chapel at midnight, candlelight reflecting off silver, the taste of blood in the air. A name formed on his lips unbidden. Father Dorian. 3 weeks of preparation followed. Adrian quit his job at the university library without explanation, liquidated his savings, and began travelling. The whispers guided him, showing him routes to avoid police checkpoints, safe places to sleep, opportunities to acquire what he would need. His dreams were filled with visions of the 11 priests he was meant to find. Their faces burned into his memory with crystalline clarity. Father Dorian ministered to the village of St. Agnes, population 847, nestled in a valley between rolling hills covered in wheat fields. The chapel was a simple structure, built of local stone with a bell tower that chimed the hours for the entire community. Dorian was beloved by his parishioners, known for his gentle demeanour and charitable works. He had served the community for 32 years without a single complaint against him. Adrian watched him for a week, learning his routines. Every night at 15 minutes past midnight, Dorian would enter the chapel for private prayer. He would light exactly 7 candles at the altar, arrange the communion elements for the next day's service, and spend an hour in silent contemplation before returning to the rectory. The man was punctual to the minute, methodical in his devotions. The chapel door was always unlocked. Dorian believed in sanctuary, in the idea that God's house should be open to anyone who needed refuge. It was a beautiful sentiment that would be his undoing. Adrian entered through the vestry, moving silently between rows of wooden pews that had witnessed a century of prayers and celebrations. The confessional booth stood in the corner, its carved oak worn smooth by countless hands seeking absolution. The wood groaned softly as Adrian settled inside to wait, the sound masked by the wind rattling the windows. At precisely 12:15, Father Dorian entered the chapel. He was a small man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore a simple black cassock, well mended but clean, and moved with the careful precision of someone whose joints reminded him daily of his age. He hummed softly as he lit the candles, a hymn Adrian remembered from his childhood. The ornate chalice sat on the altar, polished silver that caught and reflected the candlelight. It was beautiful work, donated by a wealthy parishioner decades earlier, engraved with scenes from The Passion. Adrian watched Dorian arrange the communion wafers beside it, his movements reverent and practiced. When Adrian emerged from the confessional, he moved like smoke given form. Years of watching, waiting, and planning had honed his body into an instrument of purpose. Father Dorian turned at the sound of footsteps, his face lighting up with the genuine pleasure of someone who found joy in unexpected company. "My son," he said, his voice warm with welcome. "How can I help you at this late hour? Are you troubled? Do you seek counsel?" Adrian reached the altar in 3 swift strides. His hand closed around the chalice's stem, and in one fluid motion he brought it down against the stone edge with devastating force. The silver cup shattered like an egg, leaving him holding a jagged weapon that gleamed with sharp promise. Father Dorian's expression shifted from welcome to confusion to horror in the space of a heartbeat. He raised his hands, not in defense but in blessing, his lips moving in silent prayer, even as Adrian drove the broken stem through his throat. The wound was precise, severing the carotid artery and crushing the windpipe in one terrible thrust. Blood erupted in a crimson fountain that painted the altar cloth and scattered communion wafers. Dorian's eyes went wide with shock, then glazed as his life pumped out onto the stone floor. He collapsed among the candles he had lit, his body convulsing briefly before going still. Adrian felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse, no human emotion of any kind. There was only the hollow ache in his chest and the growing certainty that this was just the beginning. He arranged Dorian's body carefully, hands folded across the chest, eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. The blood continued to spread, dark and viscous in the candlelight. Back in his motel room, the Black Bible sat exactly where he had left it on the scarred wooden table. But something had changed. As Adrian approached, still wearing Dorian's blood on his hands, the second page peeled away from the others with a sound like tearing flesh. The image revealed made Adrian's breath catch in his throat. It showed a figure kneeling before an altar, but the figure wore a crown made of thorns that had been driven deep into the skull. Blood ran down the face in geometric patterns, and the eyes had been replaced with candles that burned with an inner light. Below the image, Latin words appeared as if written by an invisible hand. Coronum spinarum clavum esse. The thorns are the key. As Adrian stared at the page, the image seemed to move in his peripheral vision. The crowned figure's mouth opened and closed silently, as if trying to speak, and the candle flames in its eye sockets flickered with an unnatural rhythm. The whispers in his head grew louder, more insistent, speaking his name in a dozen different voices. Sleep brought visions of the next priest. Father Albrecht served a parish in the German district of Milwaukee, a community of immigrants who had maintained their old world traditions despite 3 generations in America. The church of St. Godehard was a fortress of stone and stained glass built to last centuries. Albrecht himself was a relic of another era, a thin man in his 70s who still gave services in Latin and wore the traditional cassock rather than modern clerical dress. Adrian spent a week in Milwaukee, observing from the shadows. Albrecht took confessions every Tuesday and Friday evening, sitting in the ornate booth for hours, as parishioners unburdened their souls. The old priest was known for his discretion and his refusal to judge, qualities that made him beloved by his flock and dangerously predictable for someone with Adrian's purposes. Tuesday evening brought a steady stream of penitents. Adrian waited outside in his car, watching through the stained glass windows as figures moved back and forth between the confessional booth and the pews. By 9:30, the last parishioner had left, but Albrecht remained inside, cleaning and preparing for the next day's services. Adrian entered through the side door, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that ran down the centre aisle. The church was magnificent, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows above. Candles flickered at dozens of shrines, each one dedicated to a different saint, their painted eyes seeming to follow his movement through the sacred space. The confessional booth was a masterpiece of carved oak, decorated with scenes from the life of Christ. Adrian could hear Albrecht moving inside, organizing his prayer books and straightening his vestments. He approached quietly and took his place in the penitent side of the booth. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," Adrian said softly. "How long has it been since your last confession, my son?" Albrecht's voice was gentle, accented with the German inflection he had never quite lost, despite decades in America. 15 years. "Ah, that is a long time indeed. What weighs so heavily on your heart that you come to me at this late hour?" Through the wooden screen, Adrian could see the priest leaning forward, with concern. Albrecht's face was deeply lined but kind, his eyes sharp with intelligence behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore the heavy vestments of his calling, ornate robes embroidered with gold thread that caught the dim light. "I killed a priest," Adrian said quietly. "My son, we all have dark thoughts. The important thing is that you recognize—" "No," Adrian interrupted, "I actually killed him. Drove a broken chalice through his throat and watched him bleed out on his own altar." The silence that followed was deafening. Adrian could hear Albrecht's breathing change, becoming rapid and shallow. The old priest's hand moved towards something beneath his side of the booth, probably a silent alarm that connected to the rectory. Adrian burst through the partition before the priest could react. The wood splintered like kindling as Adrian's shoulder connected with the dividing screen. Albrecht cried out in his native German, scrambling backward, but there was nowhere to go in the confined space. Adrian's hands closed around the heavy vestments at the priest's throat, the rich fabric bunching in his fists. "Gott im Himmel!" Albrecht gasped, his eyes wide with terror. "Please, I have done nothing." "You exist," Adrian replied, beginning to twist the fabric. "That's enough." The vestments were beautiful work, hand-embroidered with threads of gold and silver. They depicted scenes from the Passion, Christ carrying his cross, the crucifixion, the resurrection. As Adrian pulled them tighter around Albrecht's throat, the images seemed to dance in the candlelight, a mockery of the salvation they represented. Albrecht's struggles grew weaker as his air supply was cut off. His face turned purple, veins standing out on his forehead as he clawed at the fabric around his neck. His feet drummed against the wooden floor of the booth, the sound echoing through the empty church like a desperate prayer. When it was over, Adrian arranged the body with the same care he had shown Father Dorian. Hands folded across the chest, eyes closed, face peaceful in death. The golden vestments were twisted around the throat like a noose, their beauty transformed into an instrument of execution. The drive back to his motel took 20 minutes. The black Bible waited on the table, and as Adrian entered the room, the third page separated from the others with that same wet, tearing sound. This image showed a choir of robed figures, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. But where their mouths should have been, golden thread had been used to stitch their lips shut. Their eyes were wide with silent agony, and their hands were raised in gestures that might have been prayer or supplication. Below the image, new words appeared. Silentium sacrum est, Silence is sacred. Adrian stared at the page until his eyes watered, and in the dancing candlelight of his motel room, he could swear the robed figures moved. Their stitched mouths worked soundlessly, trying to speak, and their eyes tracked his movement across the room. The whispers in his head grew louder, more urgent, speaking now in languages that seemed to predate human speech. The next priest was Father Corwin. St. Mary's Cathedral in Des Moines was a monument to faith, its twin spires reaching toward heaven like stone prayers. Father Corwin had served there for 2 decades, overseeing a congregation of nearly 3,000 souls. He was younger than the previous 2 victims, barely 50, with the robust build of a man who had played college football before hearing his calling. The cathedral was never truly empty. Even in the dead of night, someone was always there. Security guards making rounds, volunteers preparing for early morning services, or simply the faithful seeking solace in the sacred space. Adrian would need to be more careful here, more creative in his approach. He spent 5 days studying the cathedral's rhythms, learning when Corwin was most vulnerable. The priest's weakness was his devotion to the baptismal rites. Every Thursday evening, he performed a ritual cleansing of the fonts, changing the holy water and blessing the marble basins, where new Christians were welcomed into the faith. The baptismal chamber was located in the cathedral's lower level, a circular room with a domed ceiling painted with scenes of Christ's own baptism in the Jordan River. The font itself was carved from a single block of Carrara marble, its surface polished to mirror perfection. When filled with blessed water, it became a reflecting pool that seemed to hold pieces of heaven in its depths. Adrian entered through a maintenance door he had unlocked earlier, his footsteps echoing in the stone corridors that honeycombed the cathedral's foundation. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, creating a maze of darkness and amber light. He could hear Corwin moving in the baptismal chamber, humming hymns as he worked. The priest was alone, as Adrian had expected. Corwin took his duties seriously, personally ensuring that every ritual was performed correctly. He had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing muscular forearms that spoke of his athletic past. The holy water in the font was crystal clear, reflecting the painted ceiling like a window into another world. Adrian watched from the doorway as Corwin bent over the font, his hands moving in ritual gestures as he blessed the water. The priest's voice echoed in the domed chamber, speaking Latin words that had been used for centuries to sanctify and purify. He looked peaceful, content in his work, unaware that death stalked him in the shadows. When Adrian stepped into the light, Corwin looked up with surprise but no fear. The priest was used to late-night visitors, souls in crisis who sought comfort in the sacred space. He smiled warmly, water still dripping from his hands. "My son, you're out late. How can I—" Adrian moved with predatory speed, his hands closing on Corwin's shoulders before the priest could react. The man was strong, his football training still evident in his powerful frame. But surprise was Adrian's ally. He drove Corwin's head down toward the font with devastating force, the priest's skull cracking against the marble edge with a sound like breaking pottery. Corwin roared in pain and rage, blood streaming from the gash on his forehead. He spun around, his fist catching Adrian in the ribs with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. The priest was fighting for his life now, his gentle demeanor replaced by savage desperation. They grappled beside the font, crashing into the walls and sending holy water splashing across the painted floor. Corwin was stronger, but Adrian had the advantage of purpose. Every move he made was calculated, designed to wear down his opponent and create openings for the killing blow. It came when Corwin stumbled, his blood-slick feet slipping on the wet marble. Adrian caught him around the waist and drove him backward into the font, the priest's head going under the blessed water with a tremendous splash. Corwin's legs kicked frantically, his hands clawing at the sides of the basin as Adrian held him down. The blessed water turned red as Corwin's blood mixed with the sacred liquid. Bubbles rose to the surface as the priest tried to scream, his voice muffled by the water that filled his lungs. His struggles grew weaker, more erratic, until finally he lay still beneath the surface. Adrian lifted the body out and arranged it in the font, as if Corwin was sleeping, arms crossed over his chest, face serene in death. The holy water continued to seep red, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their beauty. The 4th page of the Black Bible opened that night, revealing an image that made Adrian's hands tremble. It showed altars carved from yellowed bone, their surfaces slick with something that might have been blood or tears. Candles made from human fat burned with flames that cast no shadows, their light revealing congregations of the damned kneeling in worship before something that Adrian's mind refused to fully process. Below the image, words appeared in script that seemed to move and shift: Ossibus, Edificabimus, Templum. We will build the temple from bones. As Adrian stared at the page, the candles in the image began to flicker, and he could swear he heard distant singing. Voices raised in hymns that had never been sung in any earthly church, melodies that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. The whispers in his head grew stronger, more insistent, and for the first time since discovering the Black Bible, Adrian felt something that might have been fear. But the fear was distant, muffled by the growing certainty that he was meant for this. Every priest he killed brought him closer to some ultimate revelation, some truth that had been hidden behind centuries of prayer and devotion. The hollow ache in his chest was beginning to fill with something else, something that pulsed with its own dark rhythm. The changes began with Father Malric. The Church of the Sacred Heart in Santa Fe was a adobe structure that blended Spanish colonial architecture with Native American influences. Its thick walls and red tile roof had withstood centuries of desert wind and blazing sun. Father Malric was preparing for evening mass when Adrian found him, arranging oil lamps around the altar according to an ancient tradition that predated electric lighting in the region. Malric was an elderly priest, nearly 80, with skin like weathered leather and eyes that held the wisdom of decades spent ministering to the poor and forgotten. He moved slowly but with purpose, each gesture deliberate and reverent. The oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the painted saints that covered every wall, creating an atmosphere of mystical beauty. Adrian entered through the main doors as if he were a parishioner, arriving early for services. Malric looked up and smiled, his face creasing with genuine warmth. The old priest had seen enough suffering to recognize a soul in need, and something in Adrian's appearance triggered his pastoral instincts. "Bienvenido, my son. You are early for evening mass, but you are welcome to pray while I prepare." Adrian walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing on the terracotta tiles. The church was beautiful in its simplicity, free from the Gothic grandeur of cathedrals, but no less sacred for its humble origins. The altar was carved from local wood, its surface worn smooth by generations of use. "I'm not here to pray," Adrian said softly. Something in his tone made Malric pause, an oil lamp half filled in his weathered hands. The priest's eyes sharpened, taking in details he had missed before. The hollow look in Adrian's face, the way he moved, like a predator stalking prey. The strange absence of emotion in his voice. "Then what brings you here, my son?" "Completion." Adrian reached the altar and, without warning, swept his arm across its surface. Oil lamps crashed to the floor, their contents splashing across the dry wood and ancient tapestries. Flames erupted immediately, fed by the spilled oil and centuries of accumulated dust. Malric cried out in Spanish, rushing to save the sacred objects, but Adrian caught him by the wrist. "Let it burn," Adrian said, his grip tightening until he could feel the old priest's bones grinding together. "Let it all burn." Malric tried to pull away, but Adrian's strength was no longer entirely human. The changes had begun with Corwin's death, subtle at first but growing stronger with each kill. His veins had darkened to black lines beneath pale skin, and his fingernails had grown long and sharp, stained permanently dark as if dipped in ink. His eyes held a gleam that reflected fire where there should have been none. The flames spread quickly through the dry wood and fabric, turning the beautiful church into a furnace. Ancient santos carved by forgotten artists cracked in the heat, their painted faces seeming to scream as the fire consumed them. The adobe walls held the heat like an oven, creating an inferno that would have been visible for miles if anyone had been around to see it. Malric fought with desperate strength, his aged body driven by the need to save his life's work. He managed to break free from Adrian's grip and stumbled towards the altar, trying to save what he could from the spreading flames. His cassock caught fire, the black fabric igniting like paper. Adrian watched with cold fascination as the old priest became a human torch, his screams echoing off the adobe walls. Malric rolled on the ground trying to extinguish the flames, but the fire had taken hold too completely. His cries grew weaker, more animal than human, until finally they stopped altogether. By the time the church was fully engulfed, Adrian was miles away, driving through the desert darkness with the Black Bible pulsing beside him like a living heart. The 5th page had opened, while the church burned, revealing images that made his altered vision water with tears of blood. A chalice carved from a human skull overflowed with tiny white teeth, each one perfect and gleaming. The teeth moved within the cup like living things, clicking against each other with sounds like distant laughter. Around the chalice, robed figures danced in patterns that hurt to follow, their movements creating geometries that existed in more dimensions than human perception could process. The words below were written in a script that seemed to burn itself into his retinas: ex dentibus veritas nascitur. From teeth, truth is born. Adrian drove through the night, no longer needing sleep or food. The changes were accelerating now, transforming his body into something that could better serve its dark purpose. His reflection in mirrors showed other faces staring back, priests he had yet to kill, overlaid with his own features like double exposures. The whispers never stopped, guiding him towards his next destination with iron certainty. Father Elias served a small parish in the mountains of Colorado, where snow lingered even in the late spring, and the air was thin enough to burn the lungs of lowlanders. The Church of St. Christopher perched on a rocky outcrop like an eagle's nest, its stone walls built to withstand the harsh mountain winters. Elias himself was a man of the wilderness, more comfortable hiking the backcountry than delivering sermons, though he performed both duties with equal dedication. Adrian found him working in the church's modest workshop, crafting a new processional cross to replace one damaged in a recent storm. The priest was a skilled carpenter, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who understood wood and metal as well as scripture. The cross was beautiful work, carved from local pine and fitted with iron fittings that would last for generations. The workshop was attached to the church itself, accessible through a door near the altar. Tools hung on pegs along the walls, their metal surfaces gleaming in the lamplight. The smell of sawdust and wood stain filled the air, mixing with the lingering incense from the day services. "Father Elias," Adrian said from the doorway. The priest looked up, squinting in the lamplight. He was younger than the others, perhaps 40, with the lean build of someone who spent his time hiking mountain trails and chopping firewood. His hands were calloused from honest work, and his face was weathered by high-altitude sun and wind. "I don't believe we've met," Elias said, setting down his carving tools. "Are you new to the area? I try to know all my neighbours, but folks come and go so quickly these days." "I'm just passing through." Adrian stepped into the workshop, his altered senses taking in every detail. The processional cross lay on the workbench, nearly complete, its surface smooth as silk beneath Elias's skilled hands. It was beautiful in its simplicity, unmarked by the Baroque excess of larger churches, but no less sacred for its humble origins. "That's lovely work," Adrian said, running his fingers along the cross's length. "A shame to see it go to waste." Something in his tone made Elias step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward a hammer hanging on the wall. The priest's mountain-bred instincts were screaming warnings, telling him that the stranger in his workshop was dangerous in ways that went beyond physical threat. "I think you should leave," Elias said quietly. "I think you should die." Adrian moved with inhuman speed, his hand closing around the unfinished cross. The wood was harder than oak, seasoned by mountain weather and blessed by prayer, but it felt fragile as balsa in his transformed grip. He brought it around in a vicious arc, the pointed end aimed at Elias's chest with surgical precision. The priest threw himself sideways, the cross passing so close to his ribs that it tore his shirt. He rolled behind the workbench, coming up with a wood plane in his hand, its blade gleaming sharp as a razor. For a moment they faced each other across the narrow space, predator and prey locked in a deadly dance. Elias was faster than Adrian had expected, his mountain reflexes serving him well in the confined space. He ducked under Adrian's neck swing and slashed with the plane, its blade opening a line of fire across Adrian's forearm. Black blood welled from the wound, darker than it should have been, smoking slightly in the cool mountain air. The sight of his own transformed blood seemed to energize Adrian rather than weaken him. He laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and renewed his attack with savage intensity. The cross became an extension of his will, its iron fittings gleaming as they caught the lamplight. The end came when Elias stumbled over a pile of lumber, his foot catching in the scattered wood shavings that covered the floor. Adrian's next blow took him full in the chest, the pointed end of the cross punching through his ribs with a wet, cracking sound. The iron tip emerged from his back, pinning him to the workshop door like an insect in a collection. Elias hung there for a moment, his feet barely touching the ground, his face contorted with shock and pain. Blood ran from his mouth in thick streams, staining his shirt and pooling on the floor beneath him. His eyes met Adrian's, and in them was something that might have been pity. "God forgive you," he whispered, and then he was gone. Adrian left the cross where it was, the priest's body hanging like a grotesque ornament on the workshop door. The 6th page of the Black Bible opened as he drove down the mountain, revealing images that made his transformed vision blur with tears of something darker than blood. The page showed a figure kneeling before gates made of compressed ash and bone, their surface carved with faces that screamed silently into the void. The gates were cracking, hairline fractures spreading across their surface like a spiderweb of potential. Beyond them, something vast stirred in darkness that predated light. Words appeared below the image in script that seemed to move and writhe, "Januae apperientur cum undecimo cadavere." The gates will open with the 11th corpse. Adrian understood now with crystal clarity. He was not simply killing priests out of revenge or madness. He was conducting a ritual, each death a key that unlocked another layer of some cosmic truth. The Black Bible was guiding him toward a revelation that would reshape reality itself, and he was helpless to resist even if he had wanted to. Which he didn't. The hollow ache in his chest was filling with something else now. Something that pulsed with dark purpose and whispered promises of reunion with Emma. If opening these gates would bring his sister back, he would gladly serve as the instrument of their unlocking. Father Gideon died in the wine cellar of St. Benedict's Monastery, a Romanesque structure that had stood for 8 centuries in the hills of Northern California. The monastery was famous for its vineyards, producing sacramental wine that was shipped to churches across the western United States. Gideon was the cellarer, responsible for the complex process of fermentation and aging that transformed simple grapes into the blood of Christ. The cellar was a cathedral of stone and shadow, its vaulted ceiling supported by massive pillars that had been carved from living rock. Hundreds of oak barrels lined the walls, their contents aging slowly in the perfect temperature and humidity of the underground chamber. The air was thick with the scent of fermentation, sweet and slightly acidic, with undertones of earth and time. Adrian found Gideon alone in the deepest part of the cellar, testing the wine from barrels that had been aging for a decade or more. The monk was a small, quiet man in his 60s, with the patient demeanour of someone who understood that the best things in life required time and careful attention. He wore the traditional brown robes of his order, their simple lines unmarked by vanity or worldly concerns. "Brother Gideon," Adrian said, stepping from the shadows between the barrels. The monk looked up without surprise, as if he had been expecting this visitor. His eyes were dark in the lamplight, filled with a sadness that went deeper than mere melancholy. He set down his tasting cup and folded his hands within his sleeves. "I have been praying for you," Gideon said quietly. "Ever since Father Dorian died, I have felt your approach like a storm on the horizon. You carry great darkness within you, my son." "The darkness is a gift," Adrian replied, moving deeper into the cellar. The barrels seemed to pulse around him, their contents responding to his presence with subtle vibrations that he felt in his bones. "It shows me truths that your prayers have hidden for centuries." "What truths?" "That your God is a lie. That your faith is a prison built to contain something far older and more powerful than your Christ." Gideon nodded sadly, unsurprised by the blasphemy. "I have felt it stirring, the thing that moves behind your eyes. It whispers to sensitive souls, promises power and knowledge to those who would serve its hunger. But you are wrong about one thing, my son." "What's that?" "It is not more powerful than God. It is simply louder." Adrian's laughter echoed through the stone chamber, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling and returning as a dozen mocking voices. His transformation was nearly complete now, his human appearance a thin veneer over something that belonged to older, darker realms. His eyes reflected light that didn't exist, and his shadow fell in directions that defied the laws of physics. "Your God is absent," Adrian said, drawing a knife from beneath his coat. The blade was ceremonial silver, blessed by a dozen priests before being corrupted by the blood it had already spilled. "Where was he when my sister burned? Where was he when your brothers died screaming his name?" "He was there," Gideon said simply, "in their courage, in their forgiveness, in the love that survives even death." "Pretty words," Adrian snarled, lunging forward with inhuman speed. But Gideon was ready. The old monk moved with surprising agility, ducking under Adrian's blade and rolling behind a massive oak barrel. Wine sloshed within the wooden container, decades of careful aging, threatened by the violence erupting around it. "I will not fight you," Gideon called out, his voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber, "but I will not make it easy for you either." Adrian pursued him through the maze of barrels, his knife cutting silver arcs through the lamplight. But Gideon knew the cellar like a spider knows its web, disappearing into shadows and emerging where Adrian least expected. The monk was playing for time, perhaps hoping that other brothers would hear the commotion and come to investigate. No one would come. Adrian had made certain of that, sealing the cellar doors from the outside and disabling the monastery's ancient alarm system. They were alone in this cathedral of stone and wine, predator and prey dancing their final dance. The end came when Gideon stumbled, his sandaled foot slipping on the damp stone floor. Adrian was on him instantly, the ceremonial knife finding the gap between ribs with surgical precision. The blade punched through the brown robes and into the monk's heart, stopping it with a single devastating thrust. Gideon fell among the wine barrels, his blood mixing with the spillage from containers that had cracked during their pursuit. The liquid spread across the stone floor in dark rivers, sacramental wine and human essence combining in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The monk's face was peaceful in death, his eyes closed as if in prayer. Adrian arranged the body carefully, hands folded across the chest in the traditional pose of rest. The 7th page of the Black Bible opened as he climbed the stairs from the cellar, revealing images that made his transformed vision blur with unholy tears. The page showed a figure suspended upside down from a great tree, but the tree was made of bones woven together with sinew and hair. The hanging figure wore a crown of thorns that had grown into the skull, the barbs emerging from eye sockets and mouth like a grotesque garden. Below, other figures knelt in worship, their hands raised to catch the blood that dripped from the suspended sacrifice. Words writhed across the bottom of the page in script that seemed to burn itself into his retinas: sanguis innocentium irrigat semina malitiae. The blood of the innocent waters the seeds of evil. Adrian's transformation was accelerating now, each kill bringing him closer to something that was no longer human. His reflection in mirrors showed other faces staring back. Not the priests he had killed, but the thing that was slowly consuming him from within. His veins were black rivers beneath pale skin, and his fingernails had grown into talons that left scratch marks on everything he touched. The whispers had become a constant roar, speaking in languages that predated human speech. They told him where to go, whom to find, how to complete the ritual that would open the gates between worlds. 4 more priests remained, 4 more keys to unlock the final revelation. Father Rowan served the Church of St. Peter in a fishing village on the Maine coast, where fog rolled in from the Atlantic like the breath of sleeping giants. The church was built of local granite, its stones weathered by centuries of salt spray and winter storms. The bell tower rose above the village like a lighthouse, its bronze bells calling the faithful to prayer and warning ships away from the rocky coast. Rowan was a young priest, barely 30, with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who still believed he could save the world, one soul at a time. He worked tirelessly among the fishermen and their families, offering comfort to widows whose husbands had been claimed by the sea and hope to those struggling to survive in an industry that grew more difficult each year. Adrian found him in the bell tower at midnight, pulling the ropes that sent the bronze voices singing across the dark water. It was an old tradition, the midnight bells, meant to guide lost sailors home through fog and storm. Rowan performed the duty himself rather than trusting it to automated systems, believing that the personal touch made the blessing more effective. The tower was narrow and cramped, its wooden stairs worn smooth by generations of bell ringers. The bronze bells hung in the chamber above, massive things that had been cast in foundries that no longer existed. Their surfaces were green with verdigris, marked with Latin inscriptions that spoke of faith and hope, and the eternal mercy of God. "Father Rowan," Adrian called from below. The young priest paused in his work, looking down through the narrow opening in the floor. His face was flushed with exertion, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. He smiled when he saw Adrian, the genuine warmth of someone who found joy in unexpected company. "Hello there," Rowan called down. "Are you lost? The fog's getting pretty thick out there." "I'm exactly where I need to be," Adrian replied, beginning to climb the wooden stairs. Something in his tone made Rowan's smile falter. The priest's hand moved instinctively to the bell rope, not to ring the hour, but to signal for help. But Adrian was already in the chamber, moving with the fluid grace of something that was no longer entirely bound by human limitations. "You're him," Rowan whispered, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The one who's been killing priests. The newspapers, they said." "The newspapers know nothing," Adrian interrupted. "They see only the surface, the blood and violence. They don't understand the purpose behind it." "What purpose could there be in murder?" "Liberation." Adrian moved closer, backing Rowan against the bell frame. The bronze giants hung silent around them, their surfaces reflecting the moonlight that streamed through the tower's narrow windows. The priest was young and strong, but he was also compassionate, hesitant to use violence even in self-defense. "Please," Rowan said, his voice steady, despite the fear in his eyes. "Whatever's driving you to this, it doesn't have to end in death. There's always another way, always hope for redemption." "I don't want redemption," Adrian snarled. "I want revelation." He struck without warning, his transformed hands closing around Rowan's throat with crushing force. The priest struggled, his hands clawing at Adrian's wrists, but the killer's grip was stronger than steel. Adrian lifted the young man off his feet and wrapped the bell rope around his neck, the thick hemp cutting into flesh like a garrote. Rowan's struggles grew weaker as the rope tightened, his face turning purple in the moonlight. Adrian secured the other end of the rope to the bell frame, leaving the priest hanging in the narrow space between the bronze giants. When the midnight bells rang again, Rowan's body would swing with each toll, a grim pendulum marking the passage of time. The 8th page of the Black Bible opened as Adrian descended the tower stairs, revealing images that made his altered vision weep, tears of liquid shadow. The page showed a great wheel turning slowly in a sky filled with burning stars. Figures were bound to the wheel's circumference, their bodies twisted into impossible positions as they spun through cycles of death and rebirth. At the wheel's center sat a figure that might once have been human, but was now something else entirely, its eyes replaced with candles that burned with cold flame. Below the image, words appeared in script that seemed to move and breathe. Rota fortunae pro damnatis semper descendit. The wheel of fortune always descends for the damned. Adrian understood the meaning with perfect clarity. The ritual was nearing its completion, the cosmic machinery beginning to turn toward its inevitable conclusion. 3 more priests remained, 3 more turns of the wheel before the gates opened, and something ancient stepped through into the modern world. Father Benedict served a wealthy parish in the suburbs of Chicago, where corporate executives and their families sought spiritual guidance that wouldn't interfere with their material ambitions. The Church of the Holy Family was all glass and steel, modern architecture that prioritized aesthetics over tradition. Benedict himself was a politician, as much as a priest, skilled at navigating the complex relationships between faith and finance that defined his congregation. Adrian found him in the rectory dining room, enjoying a late dinner of wine and imported cheese while reviewing financial reports from the parish's various charitable foundations. The priest was well fed and comfortable, his black cassock tailored to fit his expanding waistline. A half-empty bottle of Bordeaux sat beside his plate, its contents glowing ruby in the candlelight. "Father Benedict," Adrian said, stepping from the shadows. The priest looked up, without alarm, his wine-flushed face creasing into a practiced smile. He was used to unexpected visitors, parishioners who needed counselling at odd hours, or wealthy donors who preferred to conduct their business in private. "My son, please sit. Would you care for some wine? This bottle is quite exceptional, a gift from the Martinelli family." Adrian approached the table, slowly, his transformed senses taking in every detail. The dining room was opulent, decorated with original artwork and furniture that cost more than most people earned in a year. The contrast with the simple churches where the other priests had died was jarring, a reminder of how far the modern church had strayed from its humble origins. "You live well for a servant of God," Adrian observed. Benedict's smile never wavered, though something cautious entered his eyes. "The parish is blessed with generous supporters. We use their gifts to spread God's word and help those in need. Do you?" Adrian picked up the wine bottle, studying its label. The vintage was older than he was, worth more than most people spent on food in a month. The communion bread beside Benedict's plate was imported from France, blessed by monks who had devoted their lives to the perfect balance of flour and prayer. "You know who I am," Adrian said. "It wasn't a question. I know what you've done," Benedict replied carefully. "The police came by earlier, warning all the priests in the archdiocese. They think you might strike again soon." "They're right." Adrian moved with inhuman speed, grabbing Benedict by the throat and slamming him back into his chair. The priest's wineglass shattered on the marble floor, its contents spreading like spilled blood across the expensive stone. Benedict struggled, but his soft lifestyle had left him weak, unable to resist Adrian's transformed strength. "Please," Benedict gasped, his hands clawing at Adrian's grip. "I have money, connections, whatever you want, I can provide it." "I want your death." Adrian reached for the steak knife beside Benedict's plate, its silver blade gleaming in the candlelight. The priest's eyes went wide with terror as he realized that his wealth and influence meant nothing to this hollow-eyed killer. He tried to scream, but Adrian's grip on his throat turned the sound into a strangled wheeze. The first thrust took Benedict in the stomach, the blade sliding between ribs with surgical precision. The priest convulsed, his expensive dinner mixing with blood as it poured from his mouth. Adrian struck again and again, each blow calculated to maximize pain while prolonging the dying. Benedict's blood soaked the communion bread beside his plate, the sacred wafers absorbing his life like sponges. When it was over, Adrian arranged the body carefully in the dining chair, hands folded across the chest as if Benedict had simply fallen asleep over his meal. The wine continued to spread across the floor, mingling with blood in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The 9th page of the Black Bible opened as Adrian left the rectory, revealing images that made his transformed vision blur with tears of molten silver. The page showed a great tree growing from a mountain of skulls, its branches heavy with fruit that screamed when the wind touched them. Beneath the tree, figures knelt in worship, their mouths open to catch the tears that fell from the screaming fruit. Words writhed across the bottom of the page in script that seemed to burn. Fructus doloris nutriet novum mundum. The fruit of pain will nourish the new world. Only 2 priests remain now, 2 more keys to unlock the final revelation. Adrian's transformation was nearly complete, his human appearance a thin disguise over something that belonged to realms where geometry had different rules and physics bowed to darker laws. His shadow fell in impossible directions, and his footsteps left prints that smouldered long after he had passed. Father Thorne preached to a congregation of immigrants in East Los Angeles, where Spanish mixed with English in prayers that asked for little more than survival. The Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe was humble compared to Benedict's glass cathedral, its adobe walls painted with murals that depicted the Virgin as a brown-skinned woman who understood the struggles of the forgotten. Thorne was preparing his Sunday sermon when Adrian found him, working by lamplight in the small office behind the altar. The priest was younger than most of the others, perhaps 35, with calloused hands that spoke of manual labour before his calling. He wore simple robes, mended rather than replaced, and his desk was stacked with paperwork from the social services he provided to his community. "Father Thorne," Adrian said from the doorway. The priest looked up, his dark eyes taking in the details of his visitor with careful attention. There was something in his expression that suggested he had been expecting this moment, preparing for it through prayer and meditation. "I know why you're here," Thorne said quietly. "I've been watching the news, tracking your path across the country. You're following some kind of pattern, aren't you? Some ritual that requires exactly 11 deaths. You understand more than the others did. I've studied the old texts, the books that the church prefers to keep locked away. There are references to rituals like this, ceremonies designed to thin the barriers between worlds. But the cost is worth paying." Adrian stepped into the office, his presence seeming to dim the lamplight and leach warmth from the air. The religious artifacts on Thorne's desk began to smoke slightly, their blessed metal reacting to the corruption that radiated from the killer's transformed flesh. "What happened to you?" Thorn asked, rising from his chair. "What broke you so completely that you would serve the enemy of all creation?" "My sister died," Adrian said simply. "God let her burn while I served at his altar. That was the moment I understood the truth. That God is cruel? That God is absent." They faced each other across the small office, killer and priest. Corruption and faith made manifest. Thorn's hand moved to the crucifix on his desk, not as a weapon but as a source of strength. The silver cross began to glow with a light that had nothing to do with the lamp. Pure radiance that pushed back against the shadows gathering around Adrian. "He's not absent," Thorn said firmly. "He's simply patient. Evil always defeats itself in the end, consumed by its own hunger. You think you're opening a door to power, but you're really just digging your own grave. We'll see." Adrian lunged forward, but the light from the crucifix forced him back, burning his transformed flesh like acid. Thorn pressed his advantage, advancing, with the cross held before him like a torch in the darkness. For a moment, Adrian felt something that might have been fear, a flicker of his old humanity, responding to the priest's unwavering faith. But the Black Bible pulsed in his coat, its whispered voices drowning out doubt with promises of completion. Adrian snarled and grabbed an oil lamp from Thorn's desk, hurling it against the wall where it shattered in a burst of flame. The office began to burn immediately, the dry wood and paper feeding the fire with hungry enthusiasm. Thorn tried to maintain his position, but the spreading flames forced him back. Adrian circled like a predator, using the fire as a weapon to herd the priest where he wanted him. The crucifix's light flickered as smoke filled the air, its power diminished by the chaos and destruction. The end came when part of the ceiling collapsed, burning beams crashing down between them. Thorn stumbled, momentarily blinded by smoke and flame, and Adrian struck. His transformed hands closed around the priest's throat, lifting him off the ground with inhuman strength. "Your faith burns as easily as everything else," Adrian whispered, carrying Thorn towards the spreading fire. The priest's robes caught flame first, the simple fabric igniting like tinder. Thorn's screams mixed with the roar of the fire as Adrian held him in the heart of the blaze, watching with cold fascination as flesh and faith were consumed together. The priest's final words were a prayer, spoken even as his vocal cords were seared beyond use. Adrian left him burning in the pulpit, a grotesque parody of the sermons he would never give. The 10th page of the Black Bible opened as the church burned behind him, revealing images that made his transformed vision weep tears of liquid fire. The page showed a great serpent coiled around the world, its scales made from the screams of the damned, and its eyes burning with the light of dying stars. In its mouth it held a key made from crystallized despair, and as Adrian watched, the serpent's jaw began to open, preparing to swallow the key and unlock something that had been sealed since the birth of light. Words appeared below the image, in script that moved like living things. Clavis desperationis, aperiet, carcerem eternum. The key of despair will open the eternal prison. One priest remained, one final death to complete the ritual and open the gates that stood between worlds. Adrian's transformation was complete now, his human form a hollow shell containing something that belonged to the spaces between nightmares. His reflection showed only darkness, and his voice carried harmonics that made glass crack and metal tarnish. The whispers had become a symphony, singing in languages that predated human speech. They told him where to go, deep into the black forest of Germany, where the final priest waited, in a monastery that existed only for those with eyes to see. Father Osric had been expecting him for longer than either of them could remember, preparing for this moment through rituals that the church had forgotten centuries ago. The monastery of St. Malachi appeared through the fog like a vision from another age, its Gothic spires reaching toward a sky that seemed darker than it should have been. The building was older than the others, its stones worn smooth by winds that carried the memories of ages. Candles flickered in every window, and smoke rose from chimneys that burned wood, cut from trees that no longer grew in earthly forests. Adrian walked through the main doors without resistance, his footsteps echoing in corridors that stretched farther than the building's exterior suggested. The architecture defied rational explanation, corridors that curved back on themselves and stairs that led to floors that shouldn't exist. But Adrian navigated the maze with certainty, guided by the Black Bible's whispered directions. He found Father Osric in the chapel, kneeling before an altar carved from a single block of obsidian. The priest was younger than expected, perhaps 40, with the lean build of someone who practiced severe fasting. His eyes were dark as winter nights, and when he looked up at Adrian's approach, there was no surprise in his gaze. "You're late," Osric said softly. "I've been waiting since before you were born." The chapel was unlike any Adrian had seen, its walls covered with frescoes that seemed to move in the candlelight. The images depicted scenes from a gospel that had never been written, showing Christ's journey through realms that existed only in the spaces between prayers. The altar itself was wrong somehow, carved with symbols that predated Christianity by millennia. "You know why I'm here," Adrian said, the Black Bible pulsing in his hands like a living heart. "Of course you think you're completing a ritual, opening a door that will bring back your sister, but you're wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "The ritual was completed long ago. You're not the key, Adrian Hallow. You're the lock." The truth hit him like a physical blow. The whispers in his head suddenly made sense, their guidance leading him not toward freedom but toward imprisonment. The priests he had killed, the pages he had unlocked, the transformation of his body and soul, all of it had been designed to create the perfect vessel for something that had been waiting in the darkness since before the birth of stars. "You see it now," Osric continued, rising from his knees. "The thing that speaks to you, the entity behind the Black Bible, it needs a mortal host to exist in this reality. It chose you before you were born, arranged every tragedy in your life to break you down and rebuild you as its instrument." "No," Adrian whispered. But even as he spoke, he could feel the truth of it burning through his transformed flesh. The hollow ache in his chest wasn't grief anymore. It was emptiness, a void shaped perfectly to contain something vast and malevolent. Your sister's death, your loss of faith, your discovery of the Black Bible, all of it was orchestrated. You were never seeking revenge. You were conducting your own imprisonment. Osric moved closer, his eyes reflecting a light that had nothing to do with the candles. "But there's still a choice, Adrian. The ritual requires willing participation. You can refuse, deny the entity its vessel, and trap it in the spaces between worlds for another 1,000 years. And Emma, your sister is at peace. She was never in the prison you were about to unlock. That was just another lie, another chain to bind you to this path." Adrian felt something breaking inside him, not his heart, but the careful construction of purpose that had driven him across the country. The Black Bible burned in his hands as the entity within it realized that its plan was unraveling, that its carefully chosen vessel was beginning to understand the trap that had been laid. But understanding came too late. The monastery began to shake as something vast pressed against the boundaries of reality. The obsidian altar cracked down its center, revealing a chasm that glowed with ember light. Through the crack, Adrian could see movement, something immense stirring, in spaces that existed parallel to his own. "It's too late," he said, his voice layered with harmonics that weren't entirely his own. "I've already opened too many locks. The gates are breaking." "Then fight it," Osric urged. "Deny it entry. Choose to be human one last time." But Adrian could feel the entity pouring into him like molten metal, filling the emptiness he had carved in his own soul. His skin began to split along lines of force that existed in dimensions human perception couldn't process. Reality bleeding through the cracks as something vast folded itself into his transformed frame. He tried to resist, to hold on to the last fragments of his humanity, but the corruption had gone too deep. The whispers became screams as the entity completed its migration from the spaces between worlds to the reality of flesh and blood. Adrian's consciousness was pushed aside like a discarded coat, relegated to watching from the depths of his own mind, as something ancient took control of his body. The thing that had been Adrian Hallow stood before Father Osric, its eyes reflecting fires that burned in places with no names. When it spoke, reality bent around the words, responding to commands that rewrote the fundamental laws of physics. "The gates are open," it said with Adrian's voice. "The prison is broken. Let the faithful pray to their absent God, while the old powers walk the earth once more." Osric stepped backward, his hand moving to the silver cross at his throat, but the blessed metal began to smoke and tarnish, its power no match for the entity that wore Adrian's flesh like an ill-fitting suit. "You're too late, priest. The key has turned, the lock has opened, and the thing that your church has spent 2,000 years keeping caged is finally free." The monastery collapsed around them as the entity laughed, with Adrian's voice, its presence too vast for any earthly structure to contain. Stone and mortar crumbled like sand, revealing a sky that burned with unnatural colours. In the distance, other ancient things began to stir, responding to the call of their released sibling. Father Osric fell to his knees, not in surrender, but in prayer, his voice raised in hymns that had been old when Rome was young. The words had power, but not enough to stop what had already been unleashed. The entity, wearing Adrian's flesh, stepped through the ruins of the chapel and out into a world that was about to remember why humanity had learned to fear the dark. Behind it, the Black Bible crumbled to ash, its purpose finally fulfilled. The whispers that had guided Adrian on his path of destruction fell silent, replaced by the screams of a reality learning to accommodate things that should never have existed. In churches across the world, holy water began to boil, and sensitive souls woke from dreams of burning skies and walking shadows. The shepherds were silenced, the flock was scattered, and in the darkness between the stars, ancient things smiled with borrowed faces. The gates were open, the word had awakened, and in the deepest part of what had once been Adrian Hallow's mind, a small voice that remembered loving a sister named Emma whispered a single word into the consuming darkness: "Forgive." But there was no one left to hear it, and nothing left to forgive. The world burned, and the old gods danced in the ashes of faith.